So this week has been low-key crazy in the world of Apple. We saw long overdue iMac spec upgrades, new AirPods, and what I'm most excited for, new iPads, and more specifically, the new iPad Air. In this video, I'll be comparing the base model 11-inch 2018 iPad Pro with 64GB of storage to the base model 2019 iPad Air with 64GB of storage. My name is Ramal, welcome to my channel, and without any further ado, let's get right into it. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to be referring to the 2018 iPad Pro 11-inch as just the iPad Pro, and the 2019 iPad Air as just the iPad Air. Now, if you're a student, you want to spend the least amount of money on something that's going to get you a lot of features in the long run, and that's why I think the 2019 iPad Air is the best choice in that regard. The most notable difference between the two devices is that the iPad Pro has a much newer, updated design, with smaller bezels and a thinner device footprint, whereas the iPad Air has the recycled 10.5-inch iPad Pro design, with much bigger bezels. When it comes to bezels on an iPad, I don't think they're as intrusive as bezels on a phone, where the device is smaller in general. On an iPad, you need somewhere to hold the device with, and I think the bezels on the iPad Air are fine. Now, it's important to note that if you want an iPad with the biggest possible display, you're going to have to get the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. Now, there are many reasons as to why you might want to make this purchase, and I've made a video all about why I bought the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, and you can check that out in the link above. When it comes to displays, the iPad Pro has an 11-inch liquid retina display with rounded corners and smaller bezels, which incorporate the new Face ID sensors, whereas the iPad Air has a 10.5-inch retina display with the classic iPad design, which retains the home button and therefore Touch ID. Both displays are very similar in size, and I'm so pleased to note that both of them have fully laminated displays and don't have that horrendous air gap that we saw in the 2018 budget iPad. I don't know about you, but I find that air gaps are so distracting, especially when you're trying to watch a video or do like anything in general. Both of these iPads also have true tone displays, meaning that the color temperature of the screen changes in accordance with the color temperature of the room you're in. Some people find this feature useful, some people don't, but I personally find that it's very easy on the eyes and it doesn't give you like a really bright screen if you're in a room with much warmer tinted light. When it comes to raw power, the iPad Pro has an A12X Bionic chip, which is specifically designed for the iPad Pro and is coupled with 4GB of RAM. On the other hand, the iPad Air has the A12 chip, which is the same chip found in the iPhone XS, XS Max, and XR, and is coupled with 3GB of RAM. When it comes to everyday performance, both devices are going to perform admirably, considering that they both have the latest and greatest chips from Apple. And even though the iPad Pro has 4GB of RAM versus the iPad Air's 3GB of RAM, you're not going to see a major difference when it comes to multitasking performance, as iOS is very efficient when it comes to allocating RAM. In the camera department, both iPads are very adequately spec'd, but the iPad Pro, because it has the same cameras as the iPhone XS, is a bit better than the iPad Air. The iPad Pro has a 12MP rear shooter and a 7MP front shooter, whereas the iPad Air has an 8MP rear shooter and a 7MP front shooter. For students, both iPads are more than fine, especially when it comes to doing things like scanning documents or taking quick photos or videos of lectures or whiteboards. Since we're talking about iPads here, you're not really going to be going out in the wild and taking really scenic shots or looking for 4K video, so I think both choices are fine and the iPad Air is completely adequate for students. In terms of ports, the iPad Pro has USB-C port, whereas the iPad Air has Apple's proprietary Lightning port. I personally find that the USB-C port on the iPad Pro is much more versatile, as you can just connect any old dongle and have instant access to mirroring your iPad on different screens and even transferring photos and videos between, say, an iPad and a camera. They both also have different versions of Apple's proprietary smart connector, which means that you can grab Apple's smart keyboard folio for the iPad Pro or Apple's keyboard case for the iPad Air and have instant access to a tactile keyboard if you're looking for that sort of experience when typing on an iPad. So the comparisons that I just made are the smaller comparisons, which don't really matter in the long run. However, let me get to the big differences which might sway your decision when it comes to purchasing either the iPad Pro or the iPad Air. In my opinion, the biggest difference between the two devices aren't even in the devices themselves, they're the Apple Pencils that you can get for each respective device. The iPad Pro supports the Gen 2 Apple Pencil, which basically has inductive charging, so you just stick it onto the side of your iPad and it charges, and it also has the feature where you can double tap the side of the pencil to change between different writing utensils. On the other hand, the iPad Air only has support for the first generation Apple Pencil, which is very functionally similar to the second generation Apple Pencil, but does have a few shortcomings. One of them is the way you charge it. To charge the first generation Apple Pencil, you have to connect it to the lightning port of its host iPad, which is very precarious because one wrong move and you can snap that thing in half. It also doesn't have the double tap feature, which basically means that you can't change writing utensil just by tapping on the side of the pencil. You have to do it within the app you're using. So the second generation Apple Pencil in some ways is better than the first generation Apple Pencil, but you've also got to consider the fact that both pencils do not come standard with the iPad Pro. They are a separate purchase, and the second gen pencil does cost a bit more than the first gen pencil. Now we'll get into pricing of both iPads and the Apple Pencils in a bit, but what I'm trying to say is that you do have to pay more to get better features. Another main differences between the two devices are the speakers. So the iPad Pro has 4 speakers, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom, and provide really good audio separation when it comes to stereo sound. Now for me, this isn't really a deal breaker when comparing the two devices, but the 4 speakers on the iPad Pro are definitely nice, but you have to obviously pay more for them. Now, even though both iPads do have very similar displays, the iPad Pro does have a leg up over the iPad Air when it comes to refresh rate. So the iPad Pro has Apple's ProMotion 120Hz display, whereas the iPad Air has Apple's standard 60Hz display. Now, this isn't to say that the 60Hz panel on the iPad Air is far inferior to the 120Hz panel on the iPad Pro. But the higher refresh rate on the iPad Pro display does give it the illusion of being much faster than the iPad Air, even though it might necessarily not be. The other main difference is that the iPad Air has Touch ID, whereas the iPad Pro has Face ID. You can't really say which is the better option because Face ID, even though it is newer and technically a much better technology, it does have a few issues when you're trying to unlock your iPad when it's lying on a table or something, because you have to physically lean over and look at the iPad, whereas for Touch ID you can just rest your thumb on the home button and unlock with no issues. So that was a comparison of all the specs. Let's get into prices. The 64GB 2018 11-inch iPad Pro with Wi-Fi comes in at $749 and the Apple Pencil 2nd generation comes in at $119 for a total of $868. On the other hand, the 64GB 2019 iPad Air with Wi-Fi comes in at $479 and the Apple Pencil 1st Gen comes in at $89 for a total of $568. Now that's a $300 saving if you go with the 2019 iPad Air over the Pro, and the cheapest iPad Pro costs 50% more than the base model iPad Air, and this is compared with education pricing as well. Basically, for 2/3 of the price of the iPad Pro, you can get an iPad Air which has 95% of the same specs along with the same software capabilities through iOS. So here's my final verdict. If you're okay with the first generation Apple Pencil, 2 speakers instead of 4, and a lower refresh rate panel, the iPad Air is fine, even with the older design. However, if you want the amenities of the iPad Pro, you're going to have to shell out a bit more cash, which I don't really think is worth it if you're a student looking for an iPad for the lowest price but with the most functionality. The iPad Air also has some significant advantages over the iPad Pro. For starters, like we've mentioned, it is significantly cheaper, but it also retains the headphone jack, which Apple weirdly ditched on the iPad Pro. I don't know why, it's not like they didn't have enough space to add it in, but Apple being Apple, they ditched the headphone jack. But on the iPad Air, it's there in its full glory. Now, if you haven't been living under a rock for the past few months, you've probably heard of bend gate issues on the iPad Pro, where because of the thinner overall chassis of the iPad Pro, it's more susceptible to bending than iPads of previous generations. Since the iPad Air has the recycled design of the 10.5-inch iPad Pro, we know for certain that it's much less susceptible to bending and other weird breakages than the iPad Pro. To cap it all off, if you're a student and you're looking for a brand new iPad, the 2019 iPad Air has the best value when it comes to a new iPad, especially compared to the iPad Pro. So that is it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If I helped in some capacity, please make sure to give this video a huge thumbs up and even consider subscribing for more tech content. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments down below and I'll get to them as soon as possible. Again, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.